Fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming out today. So, this is a topic that I'm pretty interested in, and I'm pretty excited to get to talk with you about it. That this is something I've danced around the edges of for quite a while with Hagley, but no one ever asked me to really talk about it until relatively recently. And it's surprising because it ends up being an integral part of how the DuPont family operated in the United States. So what I'm going to do today is take you on a path you're probably not expecting in spirituality in the early DuPont family, but follow me down this path, and hopefully we'll get you somewhere that's meaningful for the bigger picture of the DuPont family and company here in Wilmington. So where we'll start is with this fellow, Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, the paterfamilias, if you will, of the DuPont family in the United States. He was the son of a watchmaker, lived in Paris, somebody who, if you met him early in life, you probably wouldn't think that he would have any part of larger national or world events. But as his life progressed, he ended up being somebody who became pretty influential in France, particularly in the last quarter of the 18th century. And a lot of this came from him being part of what's called the physiocratic movement. So what is that? If you want to spend a very fun day going down a huge rabbit hole, go home and Google physiocracy. It will take you in 1,000 different directions you didn't think that you would go. But the summation for us is that it's a larger economic, political, educational, spiritual philosophy based on the idea that a nation's wealth is derived from agriculture, from the land, and from productive work. And so this doesn't just land in agriculture and farming. It also extends out to manufacturing. It extends out to kind of larger economic forces in the nation, the idea being that you want a country that exports and not imports, that you can derive all of your wealth from within your own borders. But the idea within this, and why this whole idea of agriculture is so important, is that they want to make sure that people can eat and that you can have natural resources and the things that you need to operate business. Don't forget that a lot of heavy industry, all industry, you need resources to operate it. You need power to make the machines move, but then you also need raw materials to make clothing, to make machines, to have wooden benches that you're sitting on, things like that. You have to shepherd your resources to make sure that you've got them in perpetuity, and that's a lot of what they're thinking of with this. So the step beyond this, and where spirituality comes into it, is that they feel like all of this is something provided by God. That if you don't have God in the equation, if you don't have kind of a spiritual element to this, then you're missing out entirely, because where does ultimately everything around you come from? You know, it doesn't just all of a sudden appear. So to them, this is where, again, where the spiritual aspect comes in. It's something that's God provided. And to go out into nature is to look into the face of God, to commune with nature, to see these natural resources, to shepherd the resources, means that you're not only doing good for the world, but you're doing good in God's eyes, and you're doing good to God himself. So there's a lot wrapped up in what physiocracy means and how it works. But the spiritual element is one of the key parts to the larger physiocratic worldview. So DuPont de Nemours gets pretty involved in this, and a lot of his interaction with it, he said, came from actually courting his first wife, Marie Ledee, that he traveled from Paris to a Paris suburb to see her, and that on his horse rides to and from, he would look at the fields and really think about what was around him. You know, what does this mean to see these people at work in the fields? What does it mean to see crops growing in the field? What does it mean to be out here on this gorgeous sunny day? What allows this to happen? What does this mean if we can make all of this go toward a nation's wealth? So a lot of his ideas get formed through that. So his personal spirituality in a lot of ways comes from these rides back and forth to court Marie Ledee. So this is an incredibly important thing for him, which sets him up to be an important person in the 18th century. So his ideas in physiocracy ends up going pretty big for him and kind of out into the wider world. He became known pretty quickly in the salons of Paris. So his ideas from these salons go to advisors of Louis XVI. So he becomes known at court to Louis XVI pretty quickly after his rise in the 1770s. So he ends up becoming good friends with one of Louis's advisors through that, gets to meet Louis XVI, and ends up becoming part of the French financial ministry, the Ministry of the Exchequer. And also he gets to travel throughout Europe as an economic, legal, political, judicial advisor because of what he's thinking, what he's saying, all the tracts that he wrote during this era. So he ends up getting to travel to Baden, travel to Sweden, to Poland, all over the place, everywhere except Great Britain because of all the tensions going on with Great Britain and France during the 18th century. But this is something that's pretty important because he's known at court. He's somebody who ends up having the ear of Louis XVI. And he feels like through this larger physiocratic movement that they're actually getting the king's ear in the 1770s, 1780s. They really feel like that they're getting somewhere to make reforms. And this is part of the larger physiocratic worldview as well, is that they want to try to turn France around. They want to set it on a stronger economic path, but then also try to relieve the French people of all the problems they see of the ancient regime, of the old regime of the French kings and how all of the politics operates. And they feel like they're really making a lot of headway during Louis XVI's reign. Now, another person that's incredibly important to the story is Antoine Laurent Lavoisier and his wife, Marianne Pauls Lavoisier. Now, Lavoisier, how many of you have ever heard of Antoine Lavoisier? Good, there's a couple of folks here. So Lavoisier is somebody who's pretty important to the DuPont Company. They actually have an award named after him that goes to this day. He's known as the father of modern chemistry, the person who studied the effects of oxygen and reactions, someone who set the tone for what would become the scientific method, to be able to do an experiment and document it so well that people can come along behind you and figure out what you did, replicate your experiment, check your work. So his wife, Madame Lavoisier, is incredibly important because she's right there with him during all of his experiments, helping him take these notes. She's helping him do the experiments. She's just as well versed in chemistry as he is, but she's also in her own right incredibly wealthy. So she's somebody who can help push these things forward, finance a lot of what goes on, be part of this larger aristocratic world to help him get a lot of traction. So with Lavoisier and DuPont de Nemours, they meet in the salons of Paris, become friends, realize that their ideals line up in a big way. They both become part of this larger physiocratic movement. So Lavoisier, don't forget, is an important person because he's also at court. He runs the French national black powder manufactory at Essonne. He also runs the French Ministry for Mining and Saltpeter, the main ingredient of black powder for explosives. So he's somebody who's front and center in all of this too. And because of this friendship, because of these connections, DuPont de Nemours gets propelled right to the forefront in the 1780s. So then this happens. You have the problem of the French Revolution and then later the Reign of Terror. So the French Revolution happens. At first, all of the physiocrats feel elated because they're like, wow, this is going to turn things around, that people with reason, with sense, are going to come into play. They're going to, talk to the king. We're going to work all this out. But things go south pretty quickly. Then you get into the Reign of Terror, and people start losing their heads. So this really disillusions a lot of the physiocrats with the larger movement, with the revolutionary movement. Another big step in all this is that P.S. DuPont de Nemours and his youngest son, E.I. DuPont, were officers in the French National Guard, the Garde Nationale. So they had the dubious distinction of being present at the storming of the Tuileries Palace on August 10th, 1792. Unfortunately for the Garde Nationale and the Garde Suisse, the King's Guards, they all pretty much got massacred. This was a terribly bloody event. The only reason that E.I. DuPont and P.S. DuPont de Nemours escaped is that they realized that this is not going well. They needed to get out of there. They pulled the caps off of a couple of French revolutionaries, the knit caps, put them on, and literally sneaked out the side door while nobody looked. So that's great for them. They get out of this, but it's terrible because practically everybody that was under their command has now been massacred. The king, not long after this, gets taken. Everything is just going absolutely wrong in every way possible. E.I. DuPont gets out of this because people knew him as a Jacobin, so he went back to their printing press in Paris and pretended that nothing happened. DuPont de Nemours, on the other hand, ended up having a price put on his head, so he went on the lam for quite a few months and ended up back at his estate, the Bois de Fossé, in Chavannes, France. So decides to just be like, well, I'm going to go back home, let them come get me. But while he's there, he starts to rethink practically everything in physiocracy because he's come through seeing everybody massacred at the Tuileries Palace. He's seen heads roll in the streets of Paris. You know, this would make you change your mind a little bit if you have to live through something like this. The result is that he wrote a tome called The Universal Philosophy, Philosophy of the Universe, in 1792. He continually edited it up to the end of his life. So the picture that you see is of his own hand-edited version from 1814. But the bigger picture of this universal philosophy is him sitting down and elucidating how spiritually everything affected him and how this all should go forward into the larger physiocratic ideal. So it's him not changing his mind on spirituality, but doing a lot of soul-searching, a lot of thinking about what all of this means, particularly the spiritual aspect of the physiocratic movement. And so one of the things that he wrote in this, where you can tell how he's feeling, is he says, if I am the watchmaker, I, with the little that I have of wit, the immense clock of the universe also, or has also its clockmaker. So he asks, who is the clockmaker? Who is God, essentially? And his answer at that point, I do not know. Again, he's really searching here. He doesn't want to part with his spirituality. He feels like that this is an important thing, you know, that God is out there, but it's making him really change how he thinks about all this. So his spirituality goes to, from being more pie in the sky to a lot more on-the-ground level pragmatic. What can you see? What can you affect? What does reason have to do with this? Because reason becomes a big tenet of physiocracy from that point on. You know, what do rational people do? You know, do you cut people's heads off? Do you try to figure things out politically, economically, socially, talk things through? So as he is getting all this figured out, the revolutionaries find him, put him in La Force prison in Paris. So this is one of the last steps in the revolutionary era to the guillotine. Unbeknownst to him, he actually was on the list to be guillotined, but Robespierre, who accused him, lost his head first. So that more or less got him off the hook, him out of La Force prison, but this does definitely change the way he views France. But it also changes the way he views his own spirituality in the physiocratic movement. So he ends up back in La Force prison not long after this, along with E.I. DuPont. They both get thrown in, not because they're going to send them to the guillotine, but because they wanted a chance to bust up the printing press the family owned in Paris. So, you know, there's, again, a lot going on, but La Force prison's an important part of this. Now, I would be completely remiss if I didn't bring up this person in conjunction with DuPont de Nemours and his spirituality. So Thomas Jefferson becomes a pretty important person to the DuPont family. They met Jefferson when Jefferson was consul to France after the American Revolution. He and DuPont de Nemours found that they had a lot in common, particularly how they felt about economics and politics and education and spirituality, that the pragmatism is something that's coming out with DuPont de Nemours, and that's where he and Jefferson landed in a big way, the pragmatism of spirituality. How do you put this into play in the real world? You know, how do you think about all of this greater stuff and how you see it play out in the real world, or how do you apply it yourself in the real world? So he and Jefferson have a lot of conversations during this era, and their correspondence lasted to the end of DuPont de Nemours' life in 1817, even to the point where DuPont de Nemours traveled to Monticello to visit Thomas Jefferson. Unfortunately, their letters passed in the mail and Jefferson wasn't home. But still, the fact that he got invited, ended up going to Monticello, this is a pretty close connection. But with Thomas Jefferson and the DuPont family, you know, that's kind of a guiding force for them when they end up coming to the United States, is realizing that people like Jefferson are the people in power, that they're the ones who have similar economic, political, spiritual ideas and want to try to push America forward along those lines. So they make the decision, ultimately, to come to the United States in 1799. They load up everything, get into the ship, the American Eagle, come to the United States. And so as the Story goes they first sight land on January 1st, 1800, land 2 days later in Newport, Rhode Island, and the rest is history, right? So why come to America? To part of the bigger picture here, why come to America at all? It's about business prospects. So it's not about fearing that you're going to lose your head. At that point, the terror had already lost its force. What was more important to the DuPont family in this era is that there was nothing left for them in Europe. Europe was in economic chaos, particularly France. The only country that was actually doing really well was Great Britain, but in 1799, somebody from France is not going to go to Great Britain because they're at war. So what do? Where do you go? Think back to Thomas Jefferson. He's trying to get people like the DuPont family to come to the United States, not just because he thinks they're going to come and do well, but because their ideas, their ideals line up. He wants people like that here. They feel like this is going to be a good thing to do. So DuPont de Nemours ends up talking with Jacques Necker, the French minister of the Exchequer, and people like the Baroness de Stael, who are incredibly wealthy and incredibly important people. He says, hey, I'm putting together a prospectus of businesses that we want to try in the United States. It's called Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, Father and Sons and Company, and here are the things we want to try. So real estate, land speculation, dry goods, the shipping of people, goods and mail, printing and publishing, black powder manufacturing is way down on the list. This is not what the family came to the United States to do. They wanted to try other things that they thought were going to align with their ideas, ideals a lot more, but then also something that they could get far more wealthy doing than manufacturing explosives. But after they came to the U.S., one by one, everything fails, but explosives. So this is where E.I. DuPont comes into the story in a big way, along with his wife, Sophie Madeline DuPont. So E.I. DuPont is the one who started E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company. So the explosives factory just up the road, which is now Hagley, and the DuPont Company that we've all come to know and love. It starts with E.I. DuPont, but also his wife, Sophie, that she's front and center in everything that happens with the company from its founding. And so why she gets pulled into this mix is that the two of them, during the French Revolution and all of the interactions with DuPont de Nemours, is right there with him. So at all of the discussions about philosophy, spirituality around the dinner table, it's not only E.I. DuPont, but Sophie DuPont who's right there with him. She's involved in all of these discussions. When the two of them are in La Force prison, she is at the Bois de Fossé, making sure that the estate is still running, making sure that their papers are kept intact, particularly DuPont de Nemours, because he felt that his were quite important given all of the work that he had done up to that point. But whenever they're making business plans, she's right there with E.I. DuPont helping him put all this together. So the spiritual discussions are something that she's part of and something that she, along with E.I. DuPont, try to put into play once they get to the United States. So she's a pretty important player in all this, just as much as E.I. DuPont is. So also, it's well to mention that E.I. DuPont has a direct connection with Lavoisier because he studied with Lavoisier at his school for a powder and saltpeter. So he studied chemistry, yes, but studied business management. What comes with business management education in that era from someone like Lavoisier? Teaching your workers to work well for you, but also the spiritual aspect of this, take care of them. Shepherd your resources. Make sure that the place that you are set up in operation, you're not taking away from it, you're adding to it in some way. This is one of the things that Lavoisier tried to put in place with the French black powder factory at Essonne. He tried to instill that in his students, including E.I. DuPont. So that's one of the things that he brings with him to the United States, is not only everything he heard from his father, but everything that Antoine Laurent Lavoisier and Madame Lavoisier tried to pound into his head while he studied with them. So hold on to that idea. All the other businesses failed. You get E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, founded on the banks of the Brandywine in 1802, first production in 1803 of refined saltpeter, first powder sales in 1804. So E.I. DuPont's now in the United States. All the other businesses have failed. He's the one holding this up. But he's also, in a lot of ways, the inheritor of these physiocratic ideas that come from his father. So how does he put them into play? What does he learn, and how does he take this larger spiritual pragmatism and put it into play in the United States? Work with the workers and take care of your people. So he wanted to make sure that there were workers' communities close by to where people were actually going to work. How many of you have been to Hagley? So you know it's not that far up the road, right? That was way out of town in 1802. So one of the things that E.I. DuPont had to consider is how are you going to get people from Wilmington to work up there, and especially asking them to do an incredibly dangerous thing for you. So he built workers' communities, places where they can live, where they can just get up, walk to the bottom of the hill, and they're at work. He also made sure that you got paid a decent wage. So the pragmatism in that is you're asking people to do something incredibly dangerous, but also you want to make sure that they have a living. You know, this is part of, again, this larger physiocratic ideal. You know, if these people are constantly in debt to you or somebody else, what really can they contribute to you or anyone else? Whenever they're always worried about where their food's going to come from, where the money's going to come from. He created a store just up from the black powder factory called Andrew Fountain and Company that he subsidized so that workers could buy dry goods at discounted rates. He created company farms. So the Winterthur estate, the very first purpose of that was not only to graze sheep, but also to grow food for people who worked for him at the DuPont Company. They also allowed the DuPont employees to keep their money on deposit with the company. So if you had over a certain amount and a certain amount changed over time, you got paid 6.5% interest on the money you left with the company. He never wanted anybody who worked for him to be in debt to him or the company in any way. And that was something that was incredibly important to him and throughout all the people who ran the company after him. So it was never a sell your soul to the company store type of situation with the DuPont Company. And where a lot of this comes from, again, is what he learned from his father, what he learned from Lavoisier, from all these other physiocrats that he's in contact with in France. You know, it's not just something he's giving lip service to, it's something he genuinely believes and puts into practice. So that's one of the ways that this all kind of goes into what they do when they get to the United States. Also, he started widow and orphan annuities. So if you were injured terribly in an explosion, he would make sure that you continued to work for the DuPont Company, doing something that you could do even with a disability. Widows would get $100 a year for the rest of their life as long as you didn't move away or remarry, and would give widows preferential treatment for doing things like running boarding houses, cooking for workers, sewing covers on Conestoga wagons. Who would also let the orphans get into apprenticeship programs with the company, learning how to make black powder, or with the machine shop, or with the carpenters. And at the end of the day, you didn't have to stay with the company. You could go somewhere else. So this is one of the other ways they try to put it into place. Water rights and stewardship, particularly of the Brandywine River, becomes an incredibly important part of what they do. So part of the reason why the DuPont Company is situated on the banks of the Brandywine is that it's a river that flows year-round and has a lot of drop. You're right on what's called a fall line. So you're at a geological area where the water goes over a lot of rocks. It goes over an area where you go from a high elevation to a lower one. So it means that you can make a lot of water power. So there's the potential to have a lot of water power. There's also the potential for a lot of pollution, so that you have a lot of silting in the river, or pouring industrial waste into the river, things like that. E.I. DuPont got heavily involved in making sure that they followed Delaware law to the letter, so that you, whenever you put in a mill race, you had to be a certain distance from other property owners. Your tail race, where the water goes back in, had to be a certain distance. You couldn't increase the turbidity of the river. You couldn't make silting pretty bad. You couldn't pour the industrial waste in, even to the point where he filed suit against other company owners upriver for pouring their industrial waste into the river. Don't forget that this is your source of power. This is a source of drinking water for the people not only who worked for DuPont, but for the city of Wilmington. So there's a lot of reasons why you want to shepherd these resources and stewardship and water rights. So the image you're seeing is from a cartoon that was done in the early 19th century called The Fathers of the Brandywine. And what you're seeing is E.I. DuPont carrying Neptune on his back, who's pouring the Brandywine into his pocket, and everybody else supposedly is trying to catch the overspill. So he ended up getting into a lot of arguments with other mill owners because of some of these water rights and water stewardship issues, that a lot of them felt that he was trying to hog up the Brandywine, and his reply is, no, I'm trying to keep you from destroying it. So during the War of 1812, he ended up becoming part of what was called the Brandywine Mill Seats Company. So this is a map that they drew in 1816. This is roughly Rockland Paper Mill up in the Brandywine Creek State Park down to, this is Market Street in Wilmington. So everywhere you see these little black dots are where a business was or where a business could be that would use water power. Part of the point of the Brandywine Millseeds Company was to promote manufacturing on the Brandywine, but to also promote water rights, stewardship, shepherding your resources. So this is something that is, again, incredibly important to E.I. DuPont and the DuPont Company and the subsequent generations of the family. Now, many of you have probably heard of the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School. So another thing that was incredibly important to E.I. DuPont is education for the workers. So he saw a Sunday school in action at a neighboring mill, decided that he wanted to try to push this thing forward, take the next step. So he built this building, which is part of Hagley, in 1817, and got it officially incorporated in the state of Delaware. But the idea with this is that, yes, there is a spiritual aspect to a Sunday school, because a lot of the lessons taught were through Bible lessons. So you would learn to read and write by reading Bible verses, reciting Bible verses, those sorts of things. But the bigger picture of the Sunday school as it stood then was to teach workers how to read, how to write, how to be literate, because educated workers are better for themselves, better for you, if they know a little more than absolutely nothing. So that's part of the reason why to get involved with this, is he felt it was a great thing, not only for his employees, but all of the workers on the Brandywine. So built this nice building in 1817. Part of the legacy of this comes from these two ladies. The one on the left, Victorine DuPont Badouy, his oldest daughter, and her sister, Eliathera DuPont Smith. So Victorine DuPont Badouy lost her husband after about a month of marriage in 1814. Absolutely devastated her. So E.I. DuPont said, why don't you try being a teacher in this Sunday school? Maybe this will kind of help you out of this terrible place that you're in. And she found that that was really the thing that helped her move on and get into the wider world again. And part of it was because of the spiritual aspect. So she was starting to grow her own spiritual life in Philadelphia, going to boarding school, but being a part of the Sunday school kind of kicked it up a notch. So with the DuPont family up to this point, most of them are not terribly religious, but they are incredibly spiritual. And if I had to put a label on them up to that point, it would be more spiritual deists than anything, that they didn't want to be associated with organized religion. And part of that came out of this experience with the French Revolution, that they wanted to be plugged into the spiritual world but didn't want to align with Catholicism or whatever else. She, on the other hand, found a lot of her, the balm for her soul, so to speak, in organized religion. So she ends up drifting not toward anything early on. She ends up landing with Episcopalianism, but that's kind of where she ends up moving toward. And so her sister goes along with her down that path. So with this, the experience with the Sunday school, she moves further and further into organized religion and spiritualism, but also insists on letting this building be used as a meeting place for the growing religious groups on the Brandywine River. So as you have more and more workers working for DuPont, particularly Irish Catholics, they need a place to meet. So you have itinerant pastors who are moving in and out of Wilmington, move in and out of the workers' communities, who come in and they say, hey, where can we talk to people who are possibly parishioners? And they're like, we'll set up in the Sunday school building. So they let them use this building as a sanctuary, much to sometimes the opposition of two of their brothers. So after E.I. DuPont's death, Alfred Victor, the oldest son, took over in 1837 up until 1850. In 1850, their brother Henry took over. Neither of them were either particularly spiritual or religious, that they both were pretty famously anti-organized religion. Alfred to the point of saying, anybody with a collar who shows up at my doorstep, I shall throw them into the river. So he really wanted nothing to do with organized religion, but neither of them wanted to get in the way of their workers being involved with this. So part of the add-on legacy of everything we've talked about before is that they wanted to make sure that their workers had what they needed, including the spiritual aspect. So although they didn't want themselves to go to church, they didn't want this building to become a church, they didn't mind if church groups used it, or what would become a church group used it. So where I'm going to leave you today is that what ends up happening through the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School are four main local churches come out of it. So once you get a critical mass enough of people, St. Joe's on the Brandywine, Roman Catholic from 1841, the Mount Salem in 1847, and the reason I have 1879 is that's the date the building depicted was built. The older building burned and got rebuilt in 1879. then Green Hill Presbyterian in 1849, and then Christ Church Christiana 100 in 1856. So part of the larger legacy of this is because there was no opposition to these people to the people who worked for the DuPont Company being involved in a spiritual religious community. Not only did the company let them form these groups, but even subsidize building of the 4 buildings. So a lot of DuPont rock masons worked on these buildings. The company picked up some of the tab for the construction, again, knowing that this was an important part of the larger communities in which these people lived here in Wilmington. So with the DuPont family and spirituality, this is quite a big thing for the family, for the company. It's not just about them forming a church and going to the church. It's about them thinking about this larger place of themselves and their business and how it fits into an economic system, how it fits into a community. But how they view themselves as part of that system comes through this larger philosophical, physiocratic idea that they have in France that they pull strands through once they come to the United States. So whenever you're thinking about these churches, the DuPont Company, DuPont family, think about that, that it's something that goes back to the very beginning, and it's something that just kind of rides right under the surface with them in getting the company established and how they do what they do in the United States. So thank you.